Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. The show where, of course, that weird presenter just takes a different album each and every week, generates some form of discussion about it, and tries their best to, understand their thoughts and opinions on it, essentially. So, in today's episode, we are, of course, returning to the randomizer, and as you've seen, the new and improved randomizer, I might add, which is the result of an incident with me messing around with the old one, which caused the entire thing to get deleted. However, all fixed now, and I think the new one's looking a lot better, I have to say, and yeah, see if you guys like it, of course. Anyway, this recommendation, as you saw, comes from one BlackMetalMarxist, who on a review for Stars of Ice by Steve Roden suggested that the music of Greg Haines might be of interest to me. And so, I have to say, after now having both heard this album in full and having now written this very review, I think I get it. I get why this one was suggested in particular. It's the kind of thing that's just right up my alley, especially coming out of, what has essentially been a rather arduous few months. It's the kind of thing I need as well, what with my birthday literally around the corner following this episode's release as well, I find it interesting. This is always a weird time for me, so having something like this, very good, very comforting. Very, very glad of it. Let's just discuss it though today. Today, I present Komarovo by Greg Haines. And so, of course, who is Greg Haines? Well, Greg Haines is an English musician and composer from Sandhurst, Kent in the UK, of course, whose works, from what I know and have read about, seems to explore long-form neoclassical styles of music, also featuring elements of experimentalism and drone. And across the years, Haines has released, a number of different albums across a range of different labels, and there's a few collaborations with artists I have come across before, such as Machine Fabrique and even Nils Fram. And so in today's episode, we are of course reviewing Komarovo, I think it's how it's said, a half-hour composition released in 2009 on Slaapwel Records based in Berlin. And this singular composition is an incredibly moving, slow-moving track sourced from a live performance at the Grunwaldkirche in Berlin on June 12, 2009, utilising church organ, pianos and tape recorders, as well apparently as containing fragments from the composition A Hunger Artist and Mark's Descent. And so this singular track, this is a very special composition, I feel. Like, it's so slow moving, of course, that it really takes its time to develop itself. But once it does, it just truly rewards those willing to undertake the very melancholy journey the entire thing seems to express here. And I'll be honest, this is an album I was attempting to explore in the past prior to the randomizer wheel that you saw in the opening for the video, back when I was trying my best to just do requests as and when they came. However, whenever I approached this one, it was just an album I just wasn't able to apparently just sit down and listen to the entire thing. I just found it very difficult to approach this album, especially with how long it takes to develop itself. But that is until I started writing this script, where the composition just seemed to really capture this existential sense of melancholy that I've been feeling recently. An odd coincidence that I'll do my best to try explain, but we'll see how this review goes. Anyway, let's crack on with the music, shall we? So opening up with its singular title track, you're immediately greeted to a very subtle bed of lowercase electronics that feels like a sort of state of suspension in the very air itself, before faint sounds just seem to echo down these long empty passageways, far away and too brief to even be remotely discernible, I'd say. And what I actually like is that sort of incessant hum that occupies so much of that album's opener though, which as the composition progresses seems to intertwine itself in amongst other frequencies sourced from, well, who knows what. And it all just persists, even when you start getting those musical motifs of incredibly gentle drones that take so long to introduce themselves, just fading in from the very silence in the background before forming into the foreground as these large notes that build and swell up essentially. And what I find fascinating is the incredibly melancholy nature that seems to have embedded itself in amongst these particular musical motifs, especially as those drones start to build and develop, stretching those momentary fragments of frequencies or even low-end drones into these much longer lengthy passages. For me, it feels like an observation of something harrowing or melancholy, that sort of existential state of, being alone with yourself and your thoughts as the music guides your very mood itself. And for me, it becomes all the more punctuated when the presence of the church organ, starts to rear its head in amongst the faded landscape being offered by this composition, further pushed into a sad, mournful state of melancholy, especially when the piano arrives at the forefront, playing the briefest moments of these sad notes across its range of, just the range of notes the piano can essentially offer here. And what started, as lowercase murmurs has now developed into this incredibly sad little piano piece that falls so heavily on these notes towards the higher range of the piano, almost trying its best to pull some semblance of melody and tune from the composition as it becomes drowned in the very weight of its own depression, it feels. And what I find remarkable is even as we get more musical motifs forming in amongst the very landscape, the whole composition just continues its incredibly slow development of its own ideas as it further progresses. Something about the way this composition just presents itself just seems to express this incredibly tragic and sad story, I'd say. A consideration of something very personal, maybe. As though attempting to find some form of understanding of our place and time in amongst the confusion, the depression, the clouding of melancholy that distorts the worldview so subtly sometimes. It's of course mostly just how this composition comes across to me, but that is what I find so interesting about music like this, of course. To some people, especially in terms of the comments I've seen on this very album, it's very much an effortless drift into a quiet spiritual place. And I can understand that sense of spirituality of, your connection to music and stuff, but for me, I can't help but feel everything being presented in this composition, it seems to just drag me down into these depths of comforting despair, if that makes any sense. And those of you familiar with this channel, with myself, with my weird self, will know I always find music that achieves this goal to just be really fascinating. The existential nature of, depressing feelings themselves and how music can perfectly express that to us, purely through the use of sounds. Going back to the composition though, there's some wonderful moments that present themselves the more and more this composition unfolds. Now, it feels like everything is just slowly building up upon itself, even reversing and affecting previous motifs we've heard before throwing it all into this state of turmoil and confusion as it becomes more difficult to really comprehend. And what I adore is the low end moments. It comes up so much in these, these abstract droning compositions, but I just love how low ends sound, the rumble of a church organ playing bass notes that drone away, just creating such wonderful groundwork with the faintest echoes of field recordings lost within the very space itself, and the tiniest glimmers of that piano continuing to pull on those melancholy notes. I find it, quite interesting, as it's the kind of droning composition that I can't actually really predict the end result of, especially at this point in the composition. From the moment it started, I was sort of, after hearing the sort of lowercase opening, I was expecting perhaps a lowercase excursion of quiet murmuring electronics, perhaps akin to the kind of thing, heard by the likes of Steve Roden, perhaps. But instead, when the church organ comes in, it still sounds a bit like Steve Roden with the likes of proximities, I would say, with these heavy notes just slowly developing itself. But the whole composition seems to do a subtle shift, and just quiet developments, and turns more into the likes of something like the Untuning of the Sky by Sarah Davachi. Arguably, maybe, I would say so. But to touch upon that point a bit more though, it feels like a combination of some of those albums' ideas and concepts, but of course, being presented in a unique way, I would argue, something that is ultimately the vision and expression of Greg Haines himself, performing this live composition, essentially, the build-up of those incredibly quiet and subtle moments in the album's opener, slowly forming into drones, and then into composition itself that seems to so gracefully build in intensity in such a spectacular way. It results in an album that feels so oddly unique, even with that sort of sense of reminiscing, and if that makes any sense at all. It's perhaps to me in the navigation of those movements rising up and then all the way back down to the album's final moments that make it very unique, because especially as this album, it starts off so quietly, builds into drones, builds into composition, builds into turmoil as the drones become overloadingly loud, and then for the final moments of this composition, right towards the end, it brings it all the way back down to just how it started with the quietest of moments. And I have to say, the ending moments of this leave me completely floored whenever I hear it. I find as well, the effortlessness of the incredible emotional resonance of this album to be truly astounding to me. So, as I mentioned when first hearing this album, this was a difficult one for me to write about because the incredible melancholy emotion was not something I was able to approach at the time. But at this current point in time as of recording this video, and having written the script as well, like literally just the day before, it seems to have coincided with just sort of a very melancholy couple of months for me, which I just find very interesting. When I first approached it a year or so ago, it just wasn't something I was able to sit down and listen to for some reason. But now, the context is there for me, and even after now hearing the whole thing for the first time, it's still so difficult for me to really comprehend and formulate my thoughts on, as essentially when listening to it just the other day when writing, all I want to do was just sit there and just absorb the entire album from start to finish. It's interesting though, with everything going on, it's the perfect time for this album to have come up on the randomizer, and I like that it did because it pushed me to properly consider what I was experiencing when hearing this kind of music. When I first heard it a couple of years ago, I just wasn't able to click with it, and it just didn't, it wasn't something my headspace was in the right frame of mind, if that makes sense. But now, it just makes a lot more sense to me, and I'm really grateful for how this album makes me feel, because it makes you feel so much less alone in that sort of sense of melancholy, if that makes any sense. I just really like it though, from the quiet hums of those lowercase electronics, to the intermittent moments of field recordings, to the faint piano, all backed up by the incredible drone of the church organ, it all results in a singular composition that is so incredibly contemplative as it navigates across its many different movements and motifs. And all of it just pulls so heavily on my heart, just further pushing that sense of melancholy that I've been coincidentally been experiencing in these past few weeks. It's weird, but there's times in my life when I've experienced, this exact feeling. I always call it peaks and troughs. You have good moments, you have bad moments and stuff. And in those low moments though, finding solace in music and albums is always an amazing experience, and I think this is one of those moments, properly discovering the true breadth and majesty of the entire composition by Greg Haines purely just by being in that low headspace, if that makes any sense. It just perfectly captures that sense of sadness, giving me, a half hour to exactly contemplate it all, try, process and understand it, if that makes sense. Of course, maybe it doesn't make any sense, but I thought with just how this is a part of the very experience that I was having with this composition, it was worth just mentioning just in case. I don't expect it to make any sense actually, even asking if that makes sense to you, but then again, maybe with how existential it is, it doesn't actually need to, The main point of this series anyway, I find, is just me doing my best to understand my experience of music, trying to understand it and present that to you, the viewers at home. And it's certainly more interesting when it comes to these album recommendations, especially when I feel something so cathartically towards it, I feel. To try summarise, I'm not really sure what else I can say about this album's composition. It's one that really has stunned me, now that I've found myself in the position to properly hear it, And I'm quite surprised, as I don't think I was expecting the emotional intensity of this album to hit me so hard, especially when it popped up on the randomizer. But as mentioned, that is something I adore so much in music, something I'm so grateful for experiencing every time it does happen. And there's a lot I just seem to love about this composition, from its use of drones, to the piano, to the motifs that, and the emotions that carry itself throughout the entirety of everything, to even the structuring of this album, starting from silence, slowly building on that with a quiet hiss of electronics, before building up into this majestic composition, before bringing it all right back down to the silence itself at the final moment. It's something about those silence in the final moments that feels so resounding. It just hangs around long after the song has even finished, leaving you there just to contemplate the myriad of personal thoughts that the album has conjured up as a result of listening to it, I feel. It's certainly something that leaves me feeling very introspective, just looking into the recesses of my mind and thoughts and contemplating what it is I'm remembering, that sense of nostalgia, and trying to understand it in a context that fits with the very music itself. And even though there's that sense of melancholy to me, of depression, almost of sadness and weighty emotions, there is something so incredibly comforting about it as a result. A sense that we're just simply not alone in feeling this way, as to do so is to just be human. I'll be honest, I don't think any of this makes any sense at all, but I'm hoping at least some of you will get it. To be fair, I'm sure some of you will at least. I think with that though, we'll be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. A huge thanks to BlackMetalMarxist for suggesting this one, After seeing the comment came from the video exploring the album Stars of Ice by Steve Rodin, I have to say I can see why they suggested this particular album for inclusion on the show. It might have actually just been a recommendation for something to me to listen to, but yeah, I figured I'd add it to the randomizer. But yeah, that sense of weighty melancholy abstractly explored through these experimental performances, it's amazing to me. And what an introduction to the world of Greg Haines, I must say. Like I said, this album floored me. And although it's very difficult for me to comprehend and express my thoughts, I'm hoping I've at least done it some level of justice and explained just how much I adore this album now. And in any case, I'm just glad to share these albums that have an emotional impact on me. I'm always grateful for music for doing that. But also to you, the viewers, for suggesting albums like this. It's amazing when this happens to me, I have to say. Not the easiest things for me to talk about, but definitely my favourite to hear. And so yeah, I hope you have enjoyed this bizarre episode of Weird Music. Feel free to suggest albums to the new randomizer if you so wish. Still try my best to get through at least one a month. We'll see how it goes. Nearly all went wrong when I lost the old randomizer, but I have to say I think this new and improved version will definitely suffice. And so yeah, with that, I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.